Hello, everyone. Dr. Seth Greenberg here. I'm going to be sharing with you my past experiences as a teacher when I started out and made innumerable mistakes, more than I really care to think about. But if you're someone who's considering going into teaching, or perhaps you've only been teaching for a brief amount of time, or maybe you've been teaching for decades, you probably will find something very worthwhile in what I'm about to share with you, whether it's avoiding one of these positions or if you're in one of the positions, you'll be able to maybe draw upon my own experience in how to get out of it and how to resolve it. Okay. Now, let's set it up in this sense that I started teaching when I was in my teenage years, but none of these problems really started to come to the fore until I was pretty much beginning to get more and more students, which was towards the end of college. Okay. That's when I was really starting to build up a private base for my teaching, and I started to get hired by other institutions and schools and whatnot. Now, the thing about it was, up until that particular point, I loved teaching. I really was thrilled to teach, and the prospect of getting more students was something that was just an absolute, joy for me, because it was like, wow, I get another student, another student. So I didn't really have any interest in the business side of things. I didn't want to be bothered with anything else. And that sheer excitement of getting new students or being hired by another school, I just got sort of deluded into thinking I could take on everybody and not ever be overextended, right? It never really came up on my radar. Now, that, of course, came at a gigantic expense. And I put myself in some seriously stressful situations, which actually led me to, at the total peak of things, I was teaching almost 80 students a week, 7 days a week. I had my own private students, and I also was teaching for 6 other schools and programs. It was insane. And I almost did that for about a year. And I almost just imploded to the point where I didn't want to teach anymore. I was starting to hate it. I didn't want to even do any music. I didn't want to do guitar. I didn't want to do anything having to do with music. And I realized that as much as, I loved it, too much of a good thing is not a good thing at all. And when your life goes completely out of whack and it's imbalanced to that extent, something's going to give. And I fortunately didn't run into the point where I did throw up my arms and say, that's it, I'm done with this. I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I quit. I'm going to do something else with my life. And I just barely missed that. But fortunately, I did. But I don't want anyone here who's watching this, if even you're on that path, you want to avoid it, or it's not good, because if you have a passion for something, it's horrible to have it get to the point where you end up becoming either embittered, or you just are so overwhelmed that you don't want to do it anymore, and it's not enjoyable. Now, one of the things that happened was I had never thought of what my limitations were. As I said, I just wanted to keep on taking on students, and I would do anything I could to accommodate a new student, or if a school had contacted me, I'd figure out a way, even if it meant leaving me with virtually no time to get from point A to point B. And there are times when literally, if I did not time the traffic lights right, I'd be late, and it would snowball from there. So unbelievably stressful situation I put myself in, and really kind of stupid, but I learned how to say no as a result of that. So one of the things is know how much you can take on, figure that out, think about it. Don't just be like me, where it's like, yeah, I'll figure it. Oh, I can squeeze you in here. But think through it and be realistic about it. Because if you do start to put yourself in more and more stressful situations, that will still affect your teaching and your health and everything else. So not good. Just try to avoid that. So for myself, I came to find that maximum is about 4 hours in a day. 4.5 is really starting to push it. Once you pass 4.5, my ability to be completely present with the student in the lesson starts to diminish. And if you really love what you do and you value what you do and you value your students, you won't accept even if it goes from 100% down to 98%. It's not. I, for myself, have to be 100% there and not feel like every time I get to a certain student, I'm only at 98%. And then the next student after that, it starts to tail down even further to 90%. And there were days when I had literally probably like 10 or 11 hours of teaching, and I was absolutely fried. As much as I wanted to be there, there's no way. I was completely, well, not completely checked out, but I was not firing it, all the cylinders by the time I would have, compared to the student that I would have at 8:30 in the morning and a student that I would have at 8:30 at night. Not even close. So set that up, figure that out. Maybe it's going to be 5 hours for you. Maybe you have 6 hours. Who knows? Maybe it's only 3 hours, but be realistic, be honest about it, because you don't want to have your teaching suffer. You want to be able to create the best lessons that you can possibly give. And if you're stressed out and if you're overwhelmed and overextended, you're not going to be able to do it. It's just as simple as that. Now, one of the other things to recognize is stand by your policies. Okay. If you're going to limit students, for example, don't make an exception. Okay. I know that might sound a little harsh. Don't make an exception. Well, I should be able to be the judge of that. And hear me out for a second. There are two scenarios that I experienced when I was young and foolish about this. When I thought, hey, I'll make an exception. The person I really wants to take from me, and maybe it's just this one day and I'm really booked up, but yeah, okay, I'll let it slide this time. Well, as a result, scenario A was, because I let that go one time with that particular prospective student, the next prospective student, if he or she needed me to, bend my rules a little bit and make an exception, then I felt like, well, I made an exception for this other student, I should make an exception for them. You know where that's going to lead, right? I'm right back to being overwhelmed, overextended, not good. So scenario B was another thing that I experienced, which was I made an exception for one student. It was the father of a young student, and I said, no, I'll just make this one exception, and I'm going to hold to it this time. Well, the problem that I had was maybe a month or two later, another parent contacted me about lessons, and I was not going to make an exception, and I held my ground. Good thing, right? Not such a great thing. It turned out that the father of the one student also knew the father of this prospective student. And word got out that I had made an exception for them, and they did not like that all that much, understandably, because they felt like, well, why would you make an exception for this particular family and not for ours? That can mar your reputation, and it looks unprofessional, and it's, again, not a good position. It's an untenable situation to be in, and you just want to hold your ground. Just don't make any exceptions. If the person really wants to take lessons with you, just have a waiting list and explain to them, look, I value the quality of my teaching. I don't know who's going to argue with that. I've never had anyone argue on that point, at least with me so far. But, I want to provide the best lessons for all of my students. And I just cannot simply, in good conscience, take on another student and extend it. I'll put you on a waiting list. If something opens up, I will be happy to meet with you. And some students will sign up for the waiting list and others won't. So, but that way you're still holding your integrity, and you're not going to find yourself in a super stressful position as I did. Okay, so those are a couple of things. Now, that leads me into the policies issue. Well, I didn't have any policies. Nothing about cancellations, nothing for any prospective student to read. It just was totally fly by the seat of my pants and wing it, and that's that. Well, again, when you only have a handful of students, that works okay. I can keep track of who's paying me, even if it's irregular. All of these things are possible. But when you start to get 20, 30, 40 plus students, it becomes impossible to keep track of all of that. Now, I would have some students who would come on a weekly basis. Most of them came weekly, and there were others that were more sporadic. But the sporadic students also wanted me to guarantee their time slots. So some of them would come every other week, some came every third week. It was all over the place. And again, as I got more students, it became a bigger and bigger issue. Furthermore, the regularity, not only in terms of the scheduling of students, but the schedule of payments was all over the map. So I had some students that paid me per lesson, some paid me for 2 weeks or a month. Some would one time would pay me for the month, and then the next time they would pay me for, 2 weeks. It was all over the map. And again, when I started getting more and more students, I couldn't keep track of that. So I wound up in positions where I'd have students ask me if they paid me last month. Some of them would pay me in cash, and I couldn't remember because I wouldn't take any notes. I wouldn't give them an invoice. I didn't keep track of any of that. And in all of those cases, I never had them pay me because I was worried that they might be charged twice. I know full well that there were ones where I know I did not get paid, but I had no record of it. And I didn't want to run the risk of possibly being wrong. So don't get into that situation either. That is a bad position. It's very unprofessional. And in this day and age, there's absolutely no excuse to ever be in that position. You have apps, the software now. You don't have to deal with all these papers like I did when I was younger. This can all be very neatly and tidily taken care of. Invoices can be sent out monthly, and just get a regular, I recommend doing it on a monthly basis. I find that has worked best, is have a monthly tuition for your regular students. And the other thing is that regular time slots, as far as having a reserved time for a student, those are only available to weekly and to a couple bi-monthly or every other week students. The sporadic ones who were just like, hey, I'll call you when I'm ready for the next lesson, I don't reserve a time, but I make all of this abundantly clear in the beginning. And you want to be as transparent and upfront. You don't want to have these policies only to get into a bind and then to reveal them, because then you're in somewhat of an indefensible position. You need to make sure that the prospective student has read and understands this, or if you have a contract, that all of this is very clearly laid out in that form. So you got to protect yourself in that sense, because it's your reputation too. Okay. Now, if you're going to take on, for myself at least, if I'm taking on a student who's every other week, I only, as I said, take a couple students because it creates that open window on off weeks. And about 90% or more students see me on a weekly basis. Now, the same thing holds true with at-home lessons. Okay. With at-home lessons, I might teach only one or two at a time because the travel time eats away at a potential slot that would be otherwise available for a prospective student, And what I do there is, at home students, I require that the lesson is at least 1 hour and it's weekly. And the fee is more expensive because of the luxury of having the lesson at the home of the student. Now, it varies for me because if the amount of time eats up, let's say, a half an hour slot, then my fee is the usual hour plus half of the slot that gets eaten up. So I would be charging the full hour as usual if he or she was to come to me for a lesson, plus I add half of the half an hour. If it's a student who's farther away, my fee is, basically based on how much time does it take out of my schedule in terms of travel. And in most cases, I've found that everyone's been very reasonable in that regard. Every once in a while, someone isn't, but that's okay, and they'll need to find somebody else to teach them. So that's how I handle at-home students. And the sporadic students, again, they don't get a reserved time. So I'm very upfront about that. If the student says, hey, I just can't commit to a regular lesson, but I really want to take lessons with you. That's perfectly fine, but I have to tell them, look, I only take on a limited number of students, and if I reach that maximum, I will not make exceptions. I cannot do that in good conscience. So just understand that if you call me 3 months from now, I might not be able to teach you. Okay. And of course, I don't, have a reserved time for you because of the nature of seeing you on a sporadic basis. So as long as they understand that and they're okay with that up front, you're covered, you're good. So again, have this stuff available to the student in the beginning. Do not wait until you take on the student and then find yourself in these problems. Like, confirm this with the prospective student. Okay. That will save you a lot of headache, a lot of stress. And yeah, you really can't go wrong. Now, another element with regards to frequency of lessons has to do with um, payment. Now, I was mentioning that monthly tuition is the way that I go. I send out an invoice beginning of each month, and the regular students are paying for a monthly time slot on a weekly, or if it's every other week, on that basis. Okay. And I don't do makeups at all. I don't guarantee them. I don't do them. I used to do them, and the reason for my policy in not doing it, and of course, I'm not suggesting this is what you should do, but here's the reasoning, and it has worked like a charm for me because I've never been in this position that I was in before, namely, where I had one situation where it was sort of a flu season, and for about 2 or 3 weeks, almost 3 weeks, about 40 to 50% of my students were canceling. I mean, they were all out. Okay. I lost at least about 35 or more percent of my income for that month as a result of that. Actually, it wasn't for that month, it was for the following month because pretty much all of those students wanted makeups, okay, which I had been doing before. The problem is that I'd never had as many cancellations in one given month, okay. So with the studio rental that I had, the landlord doesn't care if I have a short fall and people are out and I lose 35% of the income or more. I barely could make the rent for the place and things were tight and it was an incredible stress for me. And what I started to recognize was there was also a group of students who got in the habit of really having no regard for my time, no real respect for or valuing of my skill as a teacher, and they just sort of would come and go as they pleased. And some of them would just either maybe give me a very last minute notice, or they just wouldn't show up because they felt like, well, they don't have to pay for that lesson, or if they have paid, they're going to be owed a makeup automatically, right? Well, that put me in a gigantic bind, as I mentioned. Um, and so what I recognized is I had to put into place a way of explaining to prospective students that if you're going to see me on a regular basis, you're paying for that time, that slot. Just like if you're going to a class, you're in college or what have you, the tuition you're paying is for a guaranteed slot, a guaranteed seat in that class between those hours. If you happen to miss it, well, the school doesn't reimburse you and they don't create another session for you uh, as a makeup. And I realized that for some people that sort of stinks. Things happen in life, and I've been there before. I've certainly been there plenty of times where I had like playoff tickets or something got canceled and I spent quite a bit of money, and that was that. But if you get into a position where you start doing makeups like that and you get a fairly decent roster of students and you're paying, I mean, I've had sometimes two different studios at once, and to lose 25%, 30% of an income for a month is more stress than you would really want to ever deal with. So by protecting yourself and saying, look, I don't do makeups, please understand that you're paying for that monthly slot. You're committed to the month. Okay, so if a month passes and you decide, hey, I'm not going to continue, yeah, that student's not committed for a year or for more than 1 month, but If they want to continue into the next month, then again, they're responsible for that month. Now, insofar as accommodating any sort of makeup, the only thing I tell students and parents is that, hey, if you call me and something comes up and I am able to make it work within that day or within a couple days, then I'm happy to do it. But just to understand, there's no guaranteed makeup. And if for some reason we can't reschedule within that week, then unfortunately you just miss a lesson. Okay. And that way you're going to also get students who do respect and value your time. And you're not going to deal with students who just feel like, well, I just want to come and go as I please, and I don't take this seriously, and they'll just run roughshod over you. And when you get into that and you start to deal with that, it really wears thin pretty quickly. And if you have allowed that to continue happening, as much as you really want to take umbrage and be indignant about how that student or the parent is treating you, the thing is that you put yourself in that position. So remember, whatever scenario that you're experiencing, you have to figure out, how do I get out of this? Spend your time on that. Don't spend your time blaming the parent or the student, because that's easy to have happen. Focus your energy on, hey, I'm making a mistake here. I need to ensure that the students I have do respect me and value my time. How do I do that? That was the way that I solved that. Now, one of the things that has helped me a lot that I implemented quite a long time ago was to have a free 30-minute consultation sort of lesson. It's more of a consultation. And I will do this because I want to make sure of several things. One is that I feel I can genuinely help the student. And I don't want the student to commit and recognize that, hey, perhaps this isn't going to be a good fit. Perhaps I can't help you. Or on the other side, perhaps the student doesn't feel that I'm going to be much help. So that's one thing that it prevents, is that sort of situation. The other is I want to know, where the interests of the students lie. Like what areas, what are their expectations? Do they have any? What are their goals? And get a sense of that, because if I get a sense that the motivation, for example, of a particular student is through parental coercion, for example, I don't want to have any part of that personally. I don't want to take that student on. It's not a slight against the student or really the parent, but I want the student to be taking lessons because there at least is a part of the student that does genuinely want to be there. This parent, if parent's encouraging, great. But I have come across students who had no interest whatsoever, and the parent was just giving that student an ultimatum: you will take music lessons, and you will take guitar or whatever it is. And I don't personally take on students like that. So having that free consultation, that allows me to assess that situation, if that's existing. And if I get a sense of that, then I know not to take on that student. So it saves me from that as well. Now, I'm not suggesting everyone do this, but it has worked really well for me, because basically there's no exchange of money. No one owes me anything. There's nothing. I'm not really committing to anything. The student's not committing. And that way it gives the student also the ability to decide whether it's going to be a good fit, because there has to be a sort of rapport that exists, and also a trust that the person you're seeing for lessons can really help you. Okay. If you meet with that person, you feel like, oh man, I don't know. I don't think this is going to be a good fit. Maybe at that particular point, maybe down the road it might be. But if that student doesn't feel right about taking lessons, then having that student sign on is not going to be good for anyone, I don't think. So I'm sort of in favor of doing that. There are probably other ways of going about it, but that has worked well for me, very, very well. The last part I want to get into has to do with teaching for schools. Now, I mentioned at the height of things, I was teaching for 6 schools at one point. Some of them were elementary schools, like, early in the morning classes. Some of them were after school programs, and some of them were music conservatories, music schools in the area. And one of the things that I made a big mistake about, surprise, is when I signed on to schools, I never really looked at what percentage of the tuition they were taking. What was their cut? Um, in retrospect, when I looked back at all of these schools, I would say most of them were pretty reasonable. They were fair. And by fair, I would say they took minimum of 15%, upwards of about 25% on the higher side. Most of them fell into that category, in that range. Two of them, however, were way more in terms of the cut that they took, the percentage. One of them took 40%, the other one took 50%. And if you look up, sports agents or entertainment agents or real estate agents and look at the average percentage that they get paid as a commission, it's nowhere near that. And so that's outrageous. Now, again, I should have done some research and figured that out before I signed on to them, and I didn't. So if you're going to consider teaching for a particular school, find that out. Because if they're taking 40, 50%, you may want to reconsider teaching for that institution. Had I known that going into those schools, I would not have accepted those jobs. But again, I was already committed. I already signed on. And what I ended up deciding to do when I figured out and found out that that was the percentage they were taking is I went to the directors of each of the respective schools and I said, look, can you maybe pay me a little more, because the school's taking quite a cut here. Now, in one case, the one school agreed to pay me more. They gave me a raise, but they raised the tuition of the lessons. So nothing really changed for them. The percentage was the same. And so I saw the writing on the wall with that and phased that out eventually. Now, the other institution, they said, no, we're not paying you, this is what we charge and we feel justified, and sorry, you're going to have to deal. Well, for a while, I had a substantial number of students from that particular school, and I really enjoyed these students as were great. So I was a bit in a bind, and over time, the knot in my stomach driving up to the school grew larger and larger. And then finally, the last straw was I realized that the director of the school was forcing, or at least trying to force, the teachers to order materials through the school. And the woman who ran the school would actually jack up the prices on these materials upwards of 80, 90%, which is just obscene, unconscionable. And most of these students came from like lower economic households. So that was the last straw. When I got wind of that, that was it. And I finally realized, you know what? This is really starting to chip away at me. As much as I'm enjoying the students that I have here, it's going to start affecting things more negatively, and something's going to come to a head. So I went up to the director and I said, look, I've got to give you my notice. I feel like I've got to move on, and I'm going to be leaving the school, and I'm sorry, but I'll stay here and teach until you can find a replacement. But hopefully that's within the next 2 or 3 weeks, because I'm giving you my notice. I'm going to be stopping my lessons through this particular school. Well, not much of a surprise, because this woman was a lunatic. She immediately told me to leave at that moment, even though I had students. I had one student who was already there waiting. And I said, but you want me to leave the premises right now? Well, there's students coming. She didn't care. So that goes to show how much interest she had in the students. This woman was one of the most despicable people I've ever met. So I put my arms up in the air and said, you don't have to do this. What are you going to do? I'll handle that. Okay. I just walked out. And what I had decided was if that meant I needed to take a job doing something else, then I would have done that. Because when you start compromising your own integrity and you start going against your own grain, nothing really favorable is going to come from that. And it will eventually catch up and eat you away. And the next thing you know, you'll become probably pretty embittered, resentful. And it's always, I think, tragic when someone has skills and really loves doing something and has a passion and they reach that point. That's never good. It's really sad, and I've seen it happen a lot, not only with teachers, but with musicians, plenty of musicians as well, and actually people in other professions for that matter. It's not something that's only applicable to teachers or the profession of education or the arts. I mean, something that anyone in any place can find themselves in. So that's really, if there's something to really walk away from, a key point, that's it. Don't compromise that. Even though you might be doing something you really want to be doing, if you're doing it in an environment which is sort of hostile in some way, or you have a feeling of contentiousness, or just spend your energy on figuring out how to get out of that and be in a more positive, more environment that's conducive to doing as well as you can and creating the best environment for yourself and the students that you teach. So that's really the big takeaway there. Now, I'm hoping, of course, that some of these insights, some of these reflections have been of some help. And if you are a teacher or perhaps in some other profession and there's something you want to share with your own experience that might also help other people, please, I encourage you to comment below. That would be great. And I will also be putting up other videos. Interviews will be coming up. And if you haven't already subscribed, just click the subscribe button or the bell. I think the bell is what notifies you by email when a new video has been posted. And I hope to see you around soon. And thank you very much.